Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Reagan Presidential Library. I'm Fred Ryan, Chairman of the Board of Trustees, and we're delighted to have you here this evening for this very special event. We're going to begin the program in just a moment, as we always do at the Reagan Library, with the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. But first, I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming former First Lady Nancy Reagan, escorted by Chris Matthews. Now, please remain standing and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, and please be seated. As we begin our program this evening, I'd like to recognize some special guests who are with us. First, from our Board of Trustees of the Reagan Foundation, Mr. Boone Pickens. Boone. Kathy Bush. Michael Castine, and Jerry Parsky. I'd also like to welcome our special friends from the City Councils of Simi Valley and Point Hueneme. Thank you all for being with us. And I'm especially happy to welcome Chris's wife, Kathleen Matthews, who many of you know. Kathleen was a highly rated news anchor in Washington, D.C., and now is a top executive with the Marriott Corporation, and is such a delightful person. I think by the end of the night, Chris will be described as the man who accompanied Kathleen Matthews to the Reagan Library. Well, there's a program each week that some of you may have seen where the host says, "Tell me something I don't know." Well, introducing him tonight, I thought I might tell you a couple things about Chris that you don't know. The first goes back a couple of years when Chris was invited to speak at the annual father-daughter lunch at Georgetown Visitation High School, where his daughter Caroline and my daughter Genevieve are classmates. Well, Chris applied his years of experience in the political arena and his acute observations as a journalist, and he used the venue to lay down the all-important 10 rules a father must follow with his teenage daughter. And these weren't quite commandments on stone tablets, but they were delivered with authority. And I will just tell you two of them, because those of you with teenage daughters will probably appreciate this. Rule number 1 by Chris Matthews. When driving a car containing your teenage daughter and one or more friends, do not under any circumstances participate in the conversation. Even if you know the correct answer to a question they may be pondering, do not speak. Even if there are long periods of silence in their conversation, do not utter a sound to fill the void. To do so would cause extreme embarrassment for your daughter and would be admissible evidence in any future argument with her about whether you, quote, ruined her life. Rule 2, second one of Chris's rules I'd like to share involves your presence with your teenage daughter in a public venue, such as a fast food restaurant or an ice cream shop. If any friend or acquaintance of your daughter should coincidentally enter the shop, you are to immediately discontinue any conversation with your daughter. You are to break eye contact with her and act as though you are a total stranger that has randomly been seated at her table. You are to quickly and silently depart without any further contact or other evidence of knowing her. Well, these are just two of his rules, and I have followed them with total obedience. A final thing I will tell you about the host of Hardball that you may not know is that he is an avid baseball fan and a devoted follower of his home team, Philadelphia Phillies. And thinking that he might enjoy a relaxed, low-profile night at the ball game, a year or so ago, I invited Chris to join me when the Washington Nationals hosted the Philadelphia Phillies in the new Nats Park. And it was an evening game. We were both coming from work, but Chris decided to stop by home on the way to change in from his business suit into full Phillies regalia. He arrived at the baseball park with a Phillies hat, a Phillies baseball shirt, and somehow he had obtained a bright red Phillies Letterman jacket. Chris knew the stats on every player in the stadium on both teams, and he did not hesitate to voice his thoughts from the bleachers to the players on both teams, as well as the umpire and a few other fans. So next time you hear Chris say, "Let's play hardball," be assured he speaks with authority. In all seriousness, Chris Matthews has held a front row seat to history, and before he achieved television stardom, he was in politics, and like Ronald Reagan, he achieved great success in both venues. In his position with House Speaker Tip O'Neill, he saw up close one of the defining friendships in American history, the friendship between Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill. And we are delighted that he's agreed to share some of his observations with us tonight. So please welcome to the Reagan Presidential Library, Chris Matthews.
Fred's great. Thank you, Fred. Well, it's great to be out here again, and I want to thank Mrs. Reagan for having me out here at the Ronald Reagan Library and this whole evening that is going to be before you. A few years ago, after I'd gotten to know Mrs. Reagan, I asked her if I might take her to dinner one night, and she selected one of the old haunts that she and President Reagan used to like. And when I got there, the maitre d' asked me if I was with the Secret Service. And I said, no, with great pride, I'm her date. When Mrs. Reagan arrived, it was at the new Chasen's, I asked her for a deal. I said I'd give her all the latest news from Washington, all the buzz, all the inside scuttlebutt, if she'd just give me a hint of what it was like being a movie star. And we had a great trade. Well, tonight, no deals. I'm just happy to be here, a guest of hers at this wonderful Reagan Library. My old boss, Tip O'Neill, once told me that one of the keys to Ronald Reagan's success, apart from the obvious convictions of the man politically, which won him a huge following around the country, and his communication skills, and even his great looks, he said was that rich, great American voice of his, the Ronald Reagan voice. Ronald Reagan was born to be the perfect cowboy actor. He talked like an American cowboy. He had that great resonant voice. You can hear it almost from the old drive-in movie theaters crackling through the what do you call those things you put in the car? Speaker. You're a genius. And this library, of course, is so evocative of his career and his life, both in the movies and as a man of the West. Here in these rough hills where they used to make Westerns, you catch the character of the guy, debonair, windswept, with the Pacific Ocean right out there in the distance. It will surprise none of you here tonight who watch Hardball that I spent years working on the other side of the political aisle from President Reagan. But I also like to hope that people who really watched me over the years and maybe read some of my books know that I have a lot deeper love of this country and our form of government, and yes, our politics, which I love, than I have on any side of any particular argument. I want this country to make it. I've come here tonight to offer what I believe is an important, valuable piece of the Reagan legacy, the Ronald Reagan legacy. If I have an advantage tonight of all your speakers you've had here, it's perhaps the perspective I have from where I've worked all these years isn't heard here as often as other perspectives. In the 1980s, that's about a quarter century ago, I was on the inside politically, as Fred said, right at the ringside between two men battling each other for how this country ought to be run. The Speaker of the House, an old-time liberal Democrat, and our adversary at the time, Ronald Reagan, destined to be one of the most popular, most revered, indeed, as President Obama has said, one of the few truly transformative presidents in our history. This evening, I want to highlight an often overlooked piece of that legacy, that Reagan legacy. In those years, I worked as administrative assistant to the Speaker of the House, Thomas P. Tip O'Neill, Jr. I think I saw this American government run the way it's supposed to be run. It was for me a time to remember the toughest job I ever had, and yes, the most memorable. Things got done for the American people back in the 1980s. Good things for the world, I think. Politics here in America was strong and solid. You could get your hands around it. The arguments made sense. Government seemed to work, and people felt good about things, about the country, including its politics. There was an honest argument going on back then. People disagreed about things. They had philosophical disagreement. And I love the Ronald Reagan story. He talked about the two guys out camping, because I think it tells a lot about life. Two guys are out camping, and they're in a tent, and about 3 o'clock in the morning, one guy wakes up and sees the other guy rustling to put his sneakers on. And he says to the guy, "What are you doing?" And the guy says, "There's a huge bear outside our tent." And the guy says, "Well, you can't outrun a bear." And the guy says, "No, but I can outrun you." But sometimes it's not a zero-sum game. So it's not always you win, I lose, I win, you lose. Sometimes the success of the matter depends on a good competition, a balance, where the fight makes both guys end up looking good in history. The 1980s worked because of the way two partisan adversaries, the president especially, decided to make their relationship work and be seen working. Unlike so many leaders these days, President Reagan decided to get along with his rival for the good of the country. I believe this service that he rendered the country, this model of leadership, this civil, often cordial partisanship he practiced with his adversary, stands up alongside his role even in ending the Cold War. It is something to be greatly admired and perhaps sometime in our lives, I hope, replicated. Where two people could look each other in the face and argue about something important, in this case, man to man. I remember the first time I met Ronald Reagan. It was in 1982 when he came up to Capitol Hill to deliver the State of the Union address. The president was, by tradition, using the speaker's ceremonial office for his holding room, his green room. So I walked into the room where the president was getting ready for his big speech. And I think he was drinking hot tea with lemon to get his voice right, that great Reagan voice. And of course, I was Chris Matthews. So I said to him, "Mr. President, welcome to the room where we plot against you." And here's what Reagan said. "Oh no, not after 6. The speaker says here in Washington, we're all friends after 6. He was to prove that for 8 years, to prove that he was as good as his word. As President John F. Kennedy once said, and I hope we could put this on the handprint, the palm of every politician in the country. Was I making a reference? Civility, no, it was either Palin or Feinstein, I can't tell. Civility is not a sign of weakness, Kennedy once said. Civility is not a sign of weakness. On the contrary, it's a sign of confidence in what you believe and the right of the other person to believe differently, wrong as you may think they are. This is the key to it. It was the key to it. The president and the speaker, one a conservative Republican, the other a liberal Democrat, had started out a few nights after inauguration with drinks and dinner at the White House. You know, when Tip got the call from the president, this is what he said to a pal. "The guy just invited me and Millie for dinner. How am I going to fight with him?" That evening, they spent trading Irish jokes. Both men were the kind of guys who could remember a zillion jokes. People there said it was like two old pals getting together. Two men, one 70 years old, but in great shape. The other one pushing 70 and not especially in great shape. Here's what the speaker wrote in his memoirs about the physical difference between the two men. Are you listening, Nancy? This is interesting. For a fellow his age, I've never met a man in better physical condition. I touched his arm one day, and it was like iron. I'll say this, the Democrats were damn lucky that he and I never had to settle our disagreements with boxing gloves. Both were Irish Americans, men of strong convictions about politics. It may not sound important, but the speaker loved mixing up the president's name with Don Reagan, who served initially as the Secretary of the Treasury. He loved nothing more than saying President Reagan and Don Reagan. My grandfather used to do the same thing. He loved getting the name wrong. I think it's an old Irish thing. Their differences were obvious, and not just that one was a conservative Republican and the other an old-line New Deal Democrat. Tip O'Neill was one of the toughest politicians ever. He had been elected the first Democratic speaker in Massachusetts in history up in that state by going around the state personally recruiting candidates and getting them elected to the assembly. He'd gotten his seat in Congress in 1952 after James Michael Curley, his mentor, and Jack Kennedy. And he kept it when Bobby Kennedy, here's a little story for you, tried to grab that seat back in 1954. Tip O'Neill was the guy who ran the impeachment Congress that drove Richard Nixon from the White House. I knew I was in trouble, Nixon wrote in his memoirs, when I saw that it was Tip O'Neill calling the shots up there. That man plays hardball. He doesn't know what softball is. I always said there were three parts to my boss, Tip O'Neill. One part Santa Claus, who would do anything for you. One part Black Irish, look out. And one part pure politician. To this day, I have the greatest respect for my old boss. He taught me to stick to my beliefs because he did himself every day and every night when he went to bed. He was never anybody but Tip O'Neill. He'd walk through airports, past people who didn't agree with him, and a lot of them would say so to his face. The abuse bothered him, maybe even hurt him, this big, proud man, but it never changed him from his beliefs. What an education it was to work for him day after day after day, especially when things weren't going so well. And even the nuns would come up to him and say, "Would you be nice to President Reagan?" He didn't like that at all. He could argue with the bishops. They were all Republicans. Ronald Reagan was a movie star from the 1930s and 40s and became an even bigger star as host of General Electric Theater in the 1950s and 60s. Every Sunday night at 9, GE Theater was one of the top-rated shows in television. It was number 3 one year in the ratings, and that's when there were only 3 channels. Reagan had a huge audience, and people liked him. I was one of them. I was a real fan of Ronald Reagan. For some reason, even though I was from a large family and I had 4 brothers, I always ended up going downstairs to the family rec room and watching TV alone. I had my favorite shows. I loved Sid Caesar and Steve Allen and Ronald Reagan, just as I would later love Johnny Carson. I remember one night on GE Theater, the story was about a woman who had been taken in by a communist front group here in the United States and had later agreed to serve the FBI as a double agent. She was doing it for the country and taking a lot of abuse from her neighbors for it because they thought she was a red. Ronald Reagan said as he introduced the program that night what the story meant to him personally. I never forgot that. Never forgot that, Nancy. That meant a lot to him. The thing about GE Theater that people forget is that Ronald Reagan, even though he starred in many of the programs, it was a series, they had different series every week, was mainly the program's host. He was the fella every night, Sunday night or at 9, who came on and welcomed us each week. Every Sunday night, he'd be there in people's homes, not playing a part, but as Ronald Reagan himself. And as we say today, he made the connection. This is something his political rivals, including good old Pat Brown, who he beat for governor out here in 1966, didn't ever catch on to in time. They weren't just running against an established movie star, but against someone people had taken into their homes every week. Besides that, people like movie stars. That's something the Democrats never got caught on to. They never get that one. What a life the Reagans must have had back then. Ron Reagan Jr., who I love having on Hardball, has told me what it was like growing up as a kid and coming downstairs at night when there was a party, and the guests for dinner would include people like Jack Benny, and how Jimmy Stewart would be over playing the piano in the corner. What a life. Tip O'Neill, on the other hand, could not have been less Hollywood. One of the few movies the guy ever saw in his life was Bridge on the River Kwai. Of course, that movie's a classic, a David Lean picture. It was about the British and American prisoners of war in World War II in Burma, the movie everybody saw at the time in the late 50s. Well, I remember when the speaker went to the White House one day for a reception and met Sophia Loren. And he walked up to her and he said, "You're a beautiful woman. I understand you're an actress. Were you in Bridge on the River Kwai?" Now, the movie had 3 stars: William Holden, Alec Guinness, and the great Japanese star Seshi Hayakawa. And all of it, and by the way, we kept thinking, us staff guys, which one did he think Sophia Loren was? Just to put things in perspective, William Holden was Ronald Reagan's best man. Different worlds. Reagan had his own set of blind spots. Tip was a retailer. Ronald Reagan was a wholesaler. Every day I'd get up in the morning and Tip would say to me, like a vacuum cleaner, "What do you hear? Anything special? Anything I ought to know? Where are we at?" Endless, endless, endless. As I said, he was like a vacuum cleaner for data. He'd come back from breakfast at the White House roaring with stories about how Ronald Reagan didn't know the details. He used 3x5 cards. He let Cap Weinberger do all the talking. But if Reagan was short on some of the details about Washington, and he wasn't too focused on some of the people in government, he could talk anytime he wanted. This was Reagan's great strength. Anytime he wanted to go on television or radio, he could talk to somebody that the Democrats didn't know so well, the American people. The amazing ability of a guy who grew up and then went off to Hollywood to make his name could still remember how to talk to the guy working on the factory line in Milwaukee. That amazing connection Reagan had. All those years in Hollywood, and he had that gift. And if he didn't know the details of government, as I said, he was a wholesaler, not a retailer, he knew why he was there. To cut taxes, cut the size of government, and beat the communists. Every cab driver knew why Ronald Reagan was president. People loved him to start with, and they loved him even more after the way he handled that attempt on his life in the spring of 1981. It was clear to everyone, I got to tell you, the opposition especially, that this horrific event and the way that President Reagan handled it changed everything. What he said to Nancy when he got to the hospital, "Honey, I forgot to duck." What he said to the doctors about to operate on him, "I hope you're all Republicans." That did more to put the country at ease than I can say. It also made us proud. There's a fascinating story behind those events. The top Secret Service guy, the head of presidential protection, who may have saved Ronald Reagan's life that day, is a fellow named Jerry Parr. I remembered him when he covered President Carter. In fact, he was on Marine One when we lost the election and Carter voted. If you paid attention, he's the guy who walks during the inauguration ceremony from behind the guy who's not president anymore to the new president. It's quite a sight if you pay attention. Jerry's the big guy, of course, who threw President Reagan in the car that day after he'd been hit, jumped in on top of him, and realizing the situation in an instant, got that car to George Washington University Hospital in 3 minutes flat. And that's a long ride. How Jerry came to be head of presidential protection is a great Hollywood story in itself. Jerry, like a lot of us, would go to the movies with our dads because our moms didn't want to go. A standard American practice in the old days. Who's coming to the movies with me? And he went to see a movie back in the 1930s called Code of the Secret Service with a hero named Brass Bancroft. And it inspired him to later on in his life to become a Secret Service agent and to rise up to be head of presidential protection. He was the guy that saved the president's life. And the guy who starred in that movie that inspired him to become a Secret Service agent was Ronald Reagan. One of the great stories, I think. I grew up, it's amazing how things turn out in life. I grew up watching GE Theater, being a real fan of Ronald Reagan's, and ended up having to deal with him as a political adversary day after day. The reason it worked out so well between these two fellows, President Reagan and Tip O'Neill, is they spent so many St. Patrick's Days together and birthdays together and lunches together telling Irish stories, trying to outdo each other. Everything with these guys was competition. I remember the birthday party Mrs. Reagan arranged for the president. I think it was back in 81 or 82, and Sam Donaldson was there. And when the president went to cut the cake, very ceremoniously, a real gentleman, he cut a slice for Sam Donaldson. And Sam decided to be Sam. Mr. President, you don't think you can buy us with a piece of cake, do you? And the president did a Jack Benny pause and said, "Oh, Sam, you've been bought for a lot less than that." Catch these entries in the Reagan diary we've had published by the wonderful Douglas Brinkley. I really owe a lot to him for being able to read through the Reagan diary and get ready for this today. They show how two guys managed to get along even while they were fighting the same fights, by the way, over the role of the federal government and the role the United States should play in the world that began with Alexander Hamilton, if you know history, and Thomas Jefferson. And I sincerely hope are never going to end those arguments because they're the questions that need answering in each new generation of America. And here's one of the entries in the book. This is February 1981 after dinner with the O'Neills. It was a nice evening, but maybe Tip and I told too many Irish stories. The next day after a meeting on the Soviet grain embargo, Tip had last word, and it was a good one. He told me I was president. I had to think of all the states. The gist was lifting the embargo, good for the United States and our security vis-a-vis the Soviets. Here's one from April. I'm having more luck with the demos than the repubs. Asked Tip O'Neill if I could address a joint session next week. He agreed. In June, well, here it comes. Tip is blustery on the phone and accused me of not understanding the Constitution, separation of powers, etc. He's trying to gut our program because he believes in big government. Later that year, it's Tip's birthday, and we had a good time telling stories, Irish stories. That lunch with Tip, I was told by Kenny Duberstein, who was there, went till 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It's quite a lunch. Here we go from 1982. Tip O'Neill still thinks I'm depriving the needy. Told the press I associated with the country club crowd. Hey, he plays golf and I don't. This is grown up, huh? I called Tip O'Neill. I'm not sure he's ready to give. Tip's really truly a New Deal liberal. He honestly believes that we're promoting welfare for the rich. January 1983, they're back to war. Tip and I got into a real Donnybrook. I really had my dander up. The worst of it is that Tip doesn't have the facts, but that sounds like Tip talking about him, that we're in the budget. Besides, he doesn't listen. What are they, married? I love this back and forth. The fact is, Tip spent a half century dealing with real people's problems in a working class district in Massachusetts. You have to understand the people that came to him, the old, the sick, the poor kid who couldn't afford college, were real to him. He cared about issues like breast cancer and people born with problems as part of his job. These programs weren't theory to him or budget issues. He saw the people who needed help as part of his job up in North Cambridge. Remember, he was with the working class part of Cambridge, not the Harvard part. He was the kid who grew up on his knees clipping the grass on Harvard Yard. That's who Tip O'Neill was. And they used to tell him, the overseer, get up off your knees, get off of your butt and cut the grass from your knees. He cut it with a clipper. He had a certain attitude about Harvard. He once said to a preppy, he came up and said, I've been voting for you for years. And Tip said, I didn't give you much choice, did I? Here's a note from President Reagan. He wrote it in his diary the night of March 17th, 1983. Tip is a real pal. He can really like you personally and be a friend while politically trying to beat your head in. Pretty good. Here's Tip on Reagan about the same time. Away from politics, he's a real charmer. They argued, but they were always able to talk, and there were important things at which they got together. President Reagan's chief of staff, James Baker, deserves a lot of credit for this. When the president was about to take an action, Jim would ask to come up and see the speaker privately without any press knowing about it. They would meet in the speaker's hideaway office, the one with all the knickknacks, and he'd give him a personal heads up on what the president intended to do. I figure that Jim Baker was the best chief of staff ever. And that counted for a lot across the board. I think if he had stayed on the job for 8 years, it would have been a lot better for everybody. I did have a minor tiff with Jim Baker. Jim was a waspy sort of guy, if you know. We were getting together for a big summit conference between the president and the speaker up on Capitol Hill. And the Speaker asked me to call the White House and tell them he was going to bring along his young legislative expert, R.E. Weiss, to crunch the numbers for him in the meeting. Now, the White House had designed the whole shape of the table that day. It was to be the President, the Speaker, Senate Majority Leader Howard Baker, House Majority Leader Jim Wright, White House officials Ed Meese and Jim Baker. When I told Jim Baker that the Speaker was going to bring along Ari, he said, "No staff." No staff. All I could think to say was, "Your staff." I love saying it. He said something about, "Let's be gentlemen about this," or something. Anyway, the Speaker came to the meeting with the President, with young Ari at his side, and the White House responded by bringing along, to match little Ari, the Treasury Secretary, Ronald Reagan, and the OMB Director, David Stockman. But on a lot of matters, that didn't make the newspapers. The Reagan staff and our staff got together and arranged little things that helped each other out. They were nice little things, and some of them were important little things. During the G7 meeting down in Williamsburg, which you remember, my wife was in Washington. She's the anchor of ABC News at the time in Washington, and I wanted to go along with it for the weekend, so I called up Kenny Duberstein, the White House head of congressional at the time, and I said, "Can I have a security pass?" He said, "Sure." That's how we worked out these little side deals. Made us happy. When King Sobhuza of the nation of Swaziland in Africa died in 1982, Ken put me on the delegation going to the funeral. I had been with the first Peace Corps contingent in that country back in the 60s, and now I was a traveling buddy, thanks to Ken, with Lionel Hampton. That was fun. Another time, Mike Deaver, the longtime Reagan loyalist, did a good deed, I think a really good deed. The Speaker had met him. He had met Mike at a party at columnist Mary McGrory's house, and Mike played the piano quite well, as everybody knows, and the Speaker was standing around singing songs with Mike and the others at Mary's party. A few weeks after that party, homeless advocate Mitch Snyder was on a hunger strike in Washington. He was protesting that the Navy was about to name a nuclear submarine the Corpus Christi. Mitch, I think, rightfully didn't think Body of Christ was a good name for a nuclear sub in our battle force. I suggested to the Speaker, when I got the word on this from my friend Nick von Hoffen, that he call his new acquaintance Mike Deaver. When I put through the call to the White House, Mike wasn't at the desk. When Mike called me back, I told him about the naming of the ship and the guy starving himself to death over it. Mike, who became a very good friend of mine in later years, didn't sound like he thought this was a very good reason for someone to kill himself. But that Monday, we got word that President Reagan had changed the name of the ship to the city of Corpus Christi. And Mitch Snyder, a very troubled guy, ended his hunger strike. Anyway, when Reagan came into office wanting to push tax cuts and changes in the budget, Tip O'Neill, on a much larger matter, refused to play any bureaucratic or legislative games. There were no filibusters, no efforts to jam up the system. Tip figured Reagan had the votes, and the fact was, and he believed this, it was Reagan's turn at bat. The Speaker's thinking wasn't all about good sportsmanship, of course. Here's his account of his decision why he was not going to obstruct the Reagan program when the President came in. In early March, I met with the House Republican leadership and agreed to an expedited schedule for consideration of President Reagan's economic program. At the meeting, I promised that his budget and tax cuts would come to a vote in the House before August 1st. I was fully aware of the advantage I was giving the Republicans, as all the votes would take place well within the President's honeymoon period. But my strategy was to keep in mind the long-term situation. I was convinced if the Democrats were perceived as stalling in the midst of a national economic crisis, there would be hell to pay in the midterm elections. That was Tip. In Reagan's second year, the Speaker came to Reagan's rescue when he could have left him hanging out there. There was a logjam in the budget, and both sides needed to compromise for the government to function. And here's Reagan's diary entry at that point. Tip O'Neill made a speech to the Republicans telling them why they should support me. It seems strange, both of us on the same side. In Reagan's third year, 1983, Tip and Reagan both backed the bipartisan solution to the Social Security funding, that commission. It was an historic achievement by both. On the Speaker's birthday that year, President Reagan gave a toast. Tip, if I had a ticket to heaven and you didn't have one, I would give you mine. I would give mine away and go to hell with you. Now, I think that's an overstatement. I think that's an overstatement, but a nice sentiment. In 1986, they agreed on a major tax reform program that closed a lot of loopholes and got the tax rate down to 33%. There are a lot of times that Tip backed up Reagan when he surely didn't have to. When Reagan sent troops to Lebanon that time, Tip took tremendous heat from his party, and a little from me maybe, and he stayed with Reagan far longer than it did him any good politically. He stuck with the president of Lebanon. Tip could see, no matter what he said publicly, that Reagan had won tremendous respect from the Soviets, and this was important to Tip. His buddy Dwayne Andreas of Archer Daniels Midland had come back from a business trip to Moscow, saying that when Reagan fired the wildcatting air traffic controllers, that had sent a message to the Soviets that they could understand this guy was different. Before Reagan met with Mikhail Gorbachev, Tip and Republican leader Bob Michel led a congressional delegation over. Before heading off, they went to see the president. Again, in Reagan's diary, they just wanted a last-minute briefing on our blessing. I gave them both. Tip, after meeting Gorbachev, now you got to understand who Tip is, this Irish guy from Massachusetts. He said Gorbachev reminded him of a New York lawyer. Tip. Reagan, asked to explain his relationship with Gorbachev afterwards, why they worked so well, said Gorbachev reminded him of his relations with Tip O'Neill. When Gorbachev was asked why he managed to get along with Ronald Reagan, signaling really the end of the Cold War, which we all grew up with, I did, Gorbachev said, I liked him. I was talking on the phone a couple of days ago to the speaker's daughter, Susan, who's a pal of mine, and we were talking about his father, or her father rather, and the President Reagan, and out of nowhere she said, he liked him. Funny, same words. When it came time for Tip to retire, Reagan spoke at his goodbye party, a big fundraiser for Tip's alma mater, Boston College. Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful you have permitted me in the past, and I hope in the future, that singular honor, the honor of calling you my friend. A few days later, they were back at it, of course. Quote, this is in the diary, Reagan diary. Tip O'Neill has mustered a gang of his favorite toadies in the House to hold a press conference demanding that I cancel today's nuclear test in New Mexico. I said a flat no. The thing I miss about those days, and when politics was fun, by the way, and government worked, is the big man-to-man arguments on matters of policy and principle, the role of the federal government in our lives, as I said, and in the market, and the role this government should play, this country should play in the world. Reagan thought government was a problem. Tip believed that Social Security had removed the fear millions once had of old age, that the GI Bill had built the American middle class. You get a different view of things, I said, when your job's representing the old neighborhoods, hearing people's problems day after day, year after year, like Tip did for 50 years. Whether people agreed with O'Neill or not, when he retired, the Harris poll had his job approval number, which was 67% nationally. You don't see numbers like that anymore. And that was up in Reagan country, 67% for Speaker of the House. Anyway, if there's a message here in this whole story of these two great guys, it's something my old pal Kirk O'Donnell, who was the Speaker's chief counsel, and he died way too young, Kirk did, said, always be able to talk. Long after Tip and Reagan were gone, Max Friedersdorf, who was the president's chief of congressional relations, told a lot about the Reagan-O'Neill relationship. It's about what happened after President Reagan was shot, what happened at the hospital, and before. Here's the letter that Max sent to me this spring when I said I was going to give this talk. There were two important events during the first 60 days of the Reagan administration that cemented a friendly, respectful, and yes, competitive relationship between Speaker O'Neill and President Reagan. The first decisive meeting occurred just days after Reagan's inauguration on January 20th, 1981. The president-elect was most anxious to meet O'Neill, instructed us that his first formal social event was to be the dinner in the presidential living quarters with President and Mrs. Reagan and the Speaker and Mrs. O'Neill. I extended the invitation to the Speaker, and we worked out a convenient evening within a few days of the swearing in. Also attending was James Baker, Chief of Staff to Reagan, and his wife Susan, and myself and my lovely wife Priscilla. As we gathered in the president's comfortable living room, Jim and I were edgy about the evening. That's Jim Baker. But Reagan was in quite a jovial mood and expressed pleasure at the prospect of meeting the legendary and crusty Speaker, third in line of succession and leader of a formidable majority in the House. The Speaker and Millie arrived right on time, stepping out of the residence elevator into a warm handshake from the new president. Reagan and O'Neill sat down on opposite ends of a long couch, and we all held our breath. Both of them ordered up strong drinks. And although I don't recall which one broke the ice, they were, within minutes, regaling each other with Irish jokes, each trying to top the other. Jim and I, our wives and Mrs. Reagan, all relaxed. And it was soon evident that the two most powerful politicians in the country seemed friendly towards each other, and despite the battles ahead, had good prospects for a cordial relationship. Both refreshed their drinks, and the storytelling went on for quite a while before Mrs. Reagan, whom I'm sure had heard all the president's jokes 1,000 times, interrupted the president by asking if Mrs. O'Neill and the other ladies would enjoy a tour of the presidential living quarters, including the Lincoln bedroom. Before the women returned, the leaders finished the storytelling and turned to the legislative schedule and other matters, including the State of the Union. The dinner was lovely, and the banter between the speaker and the president was like two old friends, rather than a break-the-ice affair between political rivals and legislative opponents. This early dinner set the tone of civility and comedy between the two branches of government for the next 8 years. Despite bitter fights over taxes, spending, and foreign policy that often provoked rancorous debate and harsh words, they never ruptured the basic good relationship between the president and the speaker. The second event that cemented forever the good relationship between the speaker and the president occurred in March 1981, after the attempted assassination on Reagan outside the Washington Hilton by John Hinckley. Reagan, of course, was shot in the chest and taken to George Washington Hospital, where he underwent surgery and was placed in intensive care in critical condition. Somehow, Senator Strom Thurmond talked his way past the Secret Service and entered the president's hospital room. Mrs. Reagan was quite upset when she learned about this and complained to Jim Baker. Jim called me with this story and told me to get over to the hospital and stay in the president's room and make sure no one, despite any credentials or rank, got into the sick room. For several days, this went on until the president was out of danger and could start receiving approved visitors, and the first person to be admitted was Speaker O'Neill. I was in the room on my chair, this is Max talking, where Baker had posted me when the speaker came in. He nodded my way and walked over to the bed and grasped both the president's hands and said, "God bless you, Mr. President." The president still seemed groggy, perhaps sedated, and lots of tubes and needles running in and out of his body. But when he saw Tip, he lighted up and gave the speaker a big smile and said, "Thanks for coming, Tip." They exchanged a few more words, and then the speaker, still holding one of the president's hands, got down on his knees and said he'd like to offer a prayer for the president and wanted to recite the 23rd Psalm. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside still waters." I am quite sure the president understood the speaker. Reagan recited part of the prayer with the speaker in almost a whisper. After the prayer was over, the speaker released the president's hand, stood up, and leaned over the bed and kissed him on the forehead. "I better be going. I don't want to tire you out." He then walked out the door and left. And this is Max's description of that room. The two men were so alike in certain ways, both Irish and political giants. One a Republican and the other a Democrat, one conservative, one liberal. They both fought hard for their cause, but at the end of the day, they were still friends. And both always had the best interests of the country at heart. What a wonderful generation of men. But that is another story. Two guys in their 70s, who people said were past their primes, who disagreed on everything but their love of America. They made this country work, and they showed how high-level politics is meant to be fought in a country that's too important for anything less. Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Reagan. Thank you, everybody.